The morning alarm echoed through the corridors of the UES Defiance as Captain Jake Morrison stepped onto the bridge. His coffee was still steaming in the ceramic mug that had followed him through 3 ship assignments and countless missions beyond the edge of human space. The stars outside the viewport looked different here in the Kepler system, older somehow, as if they carried secrets from the dawn of time itself. "Status report," Jake said to his second-in-command, who was already reviewing the daily briefings at her station. "We're holding steady orbit around Kepler 442c. Captain, Dr. Hayes and her team are preparing for the surface expedition. Weather looks good for the next 72 hours. Commander Amy Foster had served with Jake for 6 years, and he trusted her judgment completely. Jake nodded and took another sip of his coffee. The Defiance was on what most crew members called a milk run, a routine archaeological survey of dead worlds and systems that had been flagged by long-range sensors. It was the kind of assignment that kept experienced crews busy between the more dangerous exploration missions that pushed humanity ever deeper into unexplored space. 3 decks below, Dr. Lisa Hayes was checking her equipment for the 3rd time that morning. As the chief archaeologist aboard the Defiance, she had spent the last 15 years digging through the remains of civilizations that had risen and fallen, long before humans had even discovered fire. Most of the time, her work involved cataloging pottery fragments and trying to piece together the daily lives of species that had been extinct for millions of years, but something about Kepler 442c felt different. The planet showed signs of massive construction projects that had been abandoned. Suddenly, as if an entire civilization had simply walked away from their cities overnight. The orbital scans had detected metal signatures that didn't match any known alien technology in the Galactic Council databases. "Ready for transport, Doctor," came the voice of the transporter chief over the COM system. Lisa shouldered her field pack and walked to the transporter room. Her team of 6 specialists was already waiting, each carrying the standard equipment for a potentially dangerous surface mission. They would spend the next week mapping the largest ruins and taking samples of anything that might tell them who had built the massive structures that dotted the planet's northern continent. The transport down to the surface was smooth, and within minutes Lisa found herself standing in what had once been the central plaza of an enormous city. The buildings around her stretched toward the sky in graceful curves that seemed to flow like frozen water. The architecture was unlike anything she had seen in her career, combining mathematical precision with an organic beauty that made her catch her breath. "Spread out and begin preliminary scans," she told her team. "I want a full survey of this area before we start excavating." As her team began their work, Lisa walked toward the center of the plaza where her tricorder was detecting the strongest metal signatures. The device in her hands was standard Galactic Council technology, upgraded with human improvements that made it more sensitive than anything used by other species. What she found there made her heart race with excitement. Rising from the center of the plaza was a crystalline structure about 3 meters tall, perfectly preserved despite what appeared to be millions of years of exposure to the elements. The crystal was unlike anything in the xenoarchaeological databases. It seemed to pulse with its own internal light, and when Lisa placed her hand on its surface, it felt warm to the touch. "Captain Morrison, you need to see this," she said into her communicator. 20 minutes later, Jake materialized in the plaza with Commander Foster and 3 security officers. The sight of the crystal structure made him whistle low under his breath. "What are we looking at, Doctor?" he asked. "I think it's some kind of data storage device," Lisa replied, running her scanner over the crystal's surface. "But the technology is completely unknown. It's not matching anything in our databases, and it's definitely not from any of the major galactic civilizations." Jake studied the crystal for a long moment. In his 15 years of deep space exploration, he had learned to trust his instincts about alien artifacts. Most of them were harmless remnants of everyday life, but occasionally they discovered something that changed everything humanity thought they knew about the galaxy. "Can you interface with it safely?" he asked. Lisa nodded. "I think so. The energy readings are stable, and there's no indication of any defensive systems." I'd like to try connecting my portable analysis unit to it. Jake gave his permission, and Lisa spent the next hour setting up her equipment. The portable analysis unit was a masterpiece of human engineering, capable of translating and interpreting data from virtually any known storage medium. When she finally activated the connection to the crystal, the results were immediate and startling. Data began flowing across her screens faster than she could read it. Star charts, historical records, scientific formulas, and most importantly, records of a species that called themselves the progenitors. As the hours passed and more information downloaded, Lisa began to understand that they had discovered something far more significant than anyone had imagined. The progenitors had been ancient when the current galactic civilizations were still learning to make fire. They had possessed technology that made even the most advanced Galactic Council science look primitive, and they had used that technology to guide and protect younger species throughout the galaxy, but it was the records about Earth that made Lisa's hands shake as she read them. According to the progenitor archives, early humanity had faced extinction during the last ice age. Climate shifts and cosmic radiation had threatened to wipe out the small populations of humans struggling to survive on a frozen planet. The progenitors had intervened, subtly adjusting Earth's climate and deflecting dangerous cosmic events that would have sterilized the planet. The intervention had violated the progenitors' most sacred law, the principle of non-interference in the natural development of younger species. The debate over humanity had split their civilization down the middle. Some argued that humans showed unique potential and deserved protection. Others maintained that the law of non-interference was absolute and could never be broken. The civil war that followed had destroyed progenitor civilization. Those who had argued for helping humanity were branded as criminals and exiled. Those who opposed the intervention seized control of their government but found themselves ruling over a species that had lost faith in its own principles. In the end, the progenitors had chosen to fade away rather than continue their existence as a fractured people. But before they disappeared, they had left behind a final message in their archives. The debt of fire and ice shall be repaid when the young ones find the strength of stars. What we gave in defiance of law, they must give in fulfillment of honor. The inheritors of our legacy shall call upon them, and they must answer. Lisa read the message 3 times before its full implications sank in. Humanity owed its very existence to an extinct alien race, and according to progenitor law, this debt could be claimed by whoever had inherited their legacy. She looked up from her screens to find Captain Morrison reading over her shoulder, his face grim with understanding. "The Zilari Empire," he said quietly. Lisa nodded. The Zilari had built their power on progenitor technology salvaged from dead worlds throughout the galaxy. By the ancient laws that still governed galactic civilization, they were the legitimate inheritors of progenitor legacy, and that meant humanity owed them a debt that could never be repaid. The message from Earth reached the Defiance 3 days after Dr. Hayes made her discovery. Admiral Kate Sullivan appeared on the main screen of the ship's conference room, her face showing the strain of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Behind her, Jake could see the familiar blue and white of Earth spinning slowly in the viewport of Deep Space Command. "Captain Morrison, I need you and your team back here immediately," the Admiral said. "What Dr. Hayes found has created a situation that could affect the entire human species." Jake nodded, understanding the gravity in her voice. "We're already preparing for departure, Admiral. The archaeological team has downloaded everything they could from the crystal archives." "Good. And Captain, keep this information classified until you reach Earth. We don't need panic spreading through the colonies before we have a chance to figure out our response." The journey back to Earth took 2 weeks at maximum warp. During that time, Dr. Hayes continued working with the progenitor data, translating more records and trying to understand the full scope of what humanity owed to their ancient benefactors. The more she learned, the more worried she became about what would happen when the Galactic Council learned of the debt. When the Defiance arrived at Earth Station, Jake found Admiral Sullivan waiting for him in the main briefing room along with Ambassador Paul Carter, humanity's representative to the Galactic Council. The ambassador looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. "The situation is worse than we initially thought," Admiral Sullivan began without preamble. "Word of the progenitor archives has already leaked to the Galactic Council. We believe the Zalari Empire has been monitoring our communications." Ambassador Carter leaned forward in his chair. "3 days ago, I received a formal communication from Emperor Vexhai Zalari. He's claiming the debt under ancient progenitor law and demanding immediate repayment." Jake felt his stomach tighten. What exactly are they demanding? "Military service," the ambassador replied. "They want humanity to provide 50,000 soldiers and a battle fleet for what they're calling a pacification mission in the Andromache sector." Dr. Hayes looked up from her datapad. "I've been researching the Andromache sector. It's been a war zone for over 30 years. 3 different rebel coalitions have been fighting the Zalari Empire there, and previous Imperial expeditions have suffered massive casualties." Admiral Sullivan nodded grimly. "The Zalari are essentially asking us to do their dirty work for them. They want human soldiers to die in a conflict they haven't been able to win themselves." "Can we refuse?" Jake asked, though he already suspected. The answer. Ambassador Carter shook his head. "I've consulted with the best legal experts on Galactic Council law. The debt is legitimate under progenitor legal codes, which the Council recognizes as binding on all member species. If we refuse, the Zalari can petition for economic sanctions that would cut off trade with human colonies. And without that trade, our outer colonies would starve," Admiral Sullivan added. "We're too dependent on galactic commerce to survive." Complete isolation. Jake studied the faces around the table. These were some of the most capable people in human government and military command, and they all looked defeated before the fight had even begun. "There has to be another option," he said. "There might be," Dr. Hayes said quietly. "I've been studying the progenitor records more carefully, and I think there's something the Zalari don't know about the debt." All eyes turned to her. She activated her datapad and projected a holographic display of progenitor text above the table. "According to these records, the debt can be repaid in different ways. Military service is just one option. The progenitors also recognize what they called evolutionary service, actions that advance the development of galactic civilization as a whole." "What does that mean exactly?" Admiral Sullivan asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Dr. Hayes admitted. "But I think it might give us some flexibility in how we respond to the Zalari demands." The meeting was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Galactic Council chambers. Ambassador Carter's aide appeared on the screen, looking flustered. "Ambassador, you need to return to the council chambers immediately. Emperor Vexhai has called for an emergency session to formalize the debt claim." 2 hours later, Ambassador Carter stood before the assembled representatives of 47 species in the Great Hall of the Galactic Council. The chamber was a marvel of engineering, with each delegation seated in environmental pods suited to their particular atmospheric needs. At the center of the hall, Emperor Vexhai Zalari commanded attention with his imposing presence. The Zalari were a proud warrior race, evolved from predators on a harsh desert world. Emperor Vexhai stood, nearly 3 meters tall, his scaled hide bearing the ritual scars that marked his victories in single combat. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Honored council members," the Emperor began, "I come before you to claim an ancient debt owed by the human species. The evidence is clear and undeniable." He activated a holographic display that showed excerpts from the progenitor archives. The extinct progenitor civilization intervened to save humanity from extinction, violating their own laws in the process. Under progenitor legal codes, this creates a binding obligation that must be honored. Ambassador Carter rose to respond. "The human government acknowledges the historical accuracy of these records. However, we question whether a debt created without humanity's knowledge or consent can be considered binding under current Galactic Council law." The Emperor's eyes flashed with anger. "The debt exists regardless of human awareness. The progenitors saved your species, and now that debt transfers to their rightful inheritors, the Zalari Empire. The debate continued for hours, with various council members offering their opinions on the legal precedents involved. The Crystalline Vorthek Collective supported the Zalari position, arguing that ancient laws must be respected. The Ethereal Nymerian Federation expressed sympathy for humanity but agreed that the debt appeared legitimate. In the end, the council voted 31-16 in favor of recognizing the Zalari claim. Humanity had 6 months to provide 50,000 soldiers and a battle fleet for service in the Andromache sector. Ambassador Carter returned to Earth with the news, knowing that he was carrying what might be a death sentence for thousands of human soldiers. The political reaction was immediate and explosive. Senator Bill Thompson, leader of the hardline Independence Party, called for immediate withdrawal from the Galactic Council. "We owe nothing to dead aliens and their self-appointed inheritors," he declared in a fiery speech to the Human Senate. "Let them impose their sanctions. Humanity survived for thousands of years without alien trade, and we can do it again." But General Sam Rodriguez, the military's top strategic planner, argued for a different approach. "This might actually be an opportunity," he told Admiral Sullivan in a private meeting. "If we handle this right, we could gain respect and influence in galactic affairs. The other species see us as junior partners at best. A successful military campaign could change that." The debate raged across human space for weeks. Protesters filled the streets of major cities, some demanding resistance to alien demands, while others argued for compliance to avoid economic collapse. The outer colonies, most dependent on galactic trade, generally supported honoring the debt. The older, more established worlds favored defiance. Through it all, Dr. Hayes continued her research into the progenitor archives, convinced that there were secrets yet to be discovered that could change everything. She had a growing suspicion that the debt was not what it appeared to be, and that the progenitors had left humanity more than just an obligation to repay. They had left humanity a test. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood on the observation deck of Earth Station, watching the construction crews work around the clock to prepare the human fleet for deployment. The sight filled her with both pride and dread, pride in how quickly humanity had mobilized, and dread at what she was about to send these brave men and women to face. The decision to honor the debt had not been easy. After weeks of heated debate in the Human Senate and protests in the streets, the vote had been close. 51% in favor of compliance? The economic reality was simple. Humanity could not survive complete isolation from galactic trade. The outer colonies depended on imported food and medical supplies, while Earth itself relied on rare minerals from alien worlds to maintain its technology. But Admiral Sullivan had made sure the response would be on humanity's terms, instead of sending their best regular forces into what amounted to a suicide mission. She had authorized the formation of a volunteer expeditionary force. The call for volunteers had been answered by men and women from across human space, some seeking adventure, others driven by a sense of duty, and many simply believing that humanity needed to prove itself worthy of respect among the galactic community. Colonel Dan Mitchell had been the obvious choice to lead the mission. At 45, he was young for such a command, but his record spoke for itself. He had led successful operations against pirates in the Outer Rim and had commanded the relief mission to the Tau Ceti colonies when they were threatened by a rogue asteroid. More importantly, he was known for unconventional tactics that turned apparent disasters into victories. "Colonel, what's your assessment of our readiness?" Admiral Sullivan asked as Mitchell joined her on the observation deck. "The crews are as ready as they can be given the circumstances," Mitchell replied. "We've got good people, Admiral. Not all of them are regular military, but they're motivated and they're learning fast." The human fleet was modest by galactic standards, but impressive for a species that had only been in space for 3 centuries. The flagship UES Retribution was a heavy cruiser that had been retrofitted with experimental weapons systems. The UES Vengeance and UES Reckoning were destroyers that had been modified for long-range operations. Supporting them were 6 frigates, 3 supply ships, and a hospital ship. What made the fleet truly dangerous was not its size, but its modifications. Chief Engineer Rick Davis had spent the past month working with teams across human space to upgrade every Ship with technologies that other species would consider reckless or wasteful. Human ships had always prioritized speed and firepower over crew comfort, but these modifications took that philosophy to extremes. The other species think we're crazy for mounting those plasma cannons on the destroyers, Rick told Lieutenant Emma Johnson as they reviewed the final system checks. They say the power requirements are too dangerous for ships that size. Emma smiled grimly. At 28, she was the youngest tactical officer ever assigned to a major fleet operation, but her unconventional strategies had caught Admiral Sullivan's attention. That's because they think like bureaucrats instead of warriors. They want their crews to survive every battle. We're willing to take casualties if it means winning the war. The difference in philosophy was visible throughout the fleet. Alien ships were designed with multiple redundant systems and extensive crew protection. Human ships stripped away everything that wasn't essential for combat, cramming more weapons and engines into the available space. The result was vessels that could outfight ships twice their size, but offered their crews little chance of survival if things went wrong. Dr. Lisa Hayes had spent the past month aboard Earth Station, continuing her research into the progenitor archives while also serving as an advisor to the military planners. Her discoveries had been both encouraging and disturbing. The progenitors didn't just save humanity from extinction, she explained to Colonel Mitchell during one of their planning sessions. They specifically chose humans because of what they called our potential for evolutionary warfare. What does that mean? Mitchell asked. According to their records, most species fight wars the same way their ancestors did. They rely on superior numbers or better technology or defensive positions. But humans adapt constantly during conflict. We learn from our mistakes faster than any other species they studied, and we're willing to try tactics that seem impossible or suicidal. This insight had shaped Lieutenant Johnson's battle plans for the Andromache sector. While the Zalari had provided intelligence about rebel positions and strength estimates, Emma had focused on developing strategies that played to humanity's unique strengths. The rebels have been fighting the Zalari for 30 years, she explained to the assembled ship captains. They know every Zalari tactic and counter-tactic, but they've never fought humans before. We're going to do things they won't expect. Her plans included psychological warfare techniques that would seem primitive to advanced aliens, but had proven effective throughout human history. Human ships would broadcast messages in multiple languages, offering amnesty to rebels who surrendered. While threatening terrible consequences for continued resistance, they would use deception and misdirection, making their small fleet appear larger through coordinated sensor ghosts and false communications. Most importantly, they would employ what Emma called calculated recklessness, tactics that involved accepting heavy casualties in exchange for decisive tactical advantages. While other species tried to minimize losses, humans were prepared to sacrifice ships and crews if it meant achieving their objectives. Dr. Tony Walsh, the fleet's military psychologist, had concerns about this approach. We're asking people to die for a debt they had no part in creating, he told Admiral Sullivan. Some of the crew members are having second thoughts about the mission. That's natural, the Admiral replied. But we've made our choice as a species. These people volunteered knowing what they were getting into. The psychological preparation was as important as the technical modifications. Human crews were trained to think of the mission not as a suicide run but as a chance to prove humanity's worth to the galaxy. They were told that their actions would determine whether future generations of humans would be respected as equals or dismissed as primitive newcomers. As the departure date approached, Colonel Mitchell found himself studying the intelligence reports from the Andromache sector with growing unease. The situation was far more complex than the Zalari had indicated. 3 separate rebel factions controlled different parts of the sector, and they had been fighting each other almost as much as they fought the Empire. The Crimson Fleet was led by Admiral Troy Baker, a former Zalari naval officer who had defected after witnessing what he called imperial atrocities against civilian populations. The Free Colonies Alliance was a loose confederation of human and alien settlements that had declared independence from both the Empire and the Galactic Council. The third faction, called the Liberation Front, was made up of various species that had been conquered by the Zalari and wanted revenge. "This isn't going to be a simple pacification mission," Mitchell told Admiral Sullivan during their final briefing. "We're walking into a three-way civil war where everyone will shoot at us first and ask questions later." "I know," the Admiral replied. "But we've committed to this course of action. The question is whether we're going to follow Zalari orders blindly or find our own way to fulfill the debt." The night before departure, Dr. Hayes made one final discovery. In the progenitor archives that changed everything she thought she knew about the mission. Hidden in the deepest layers of the crystal's data storage was a message that had been encrypted with mathematical codes that only a species with advanced spaceflight could decipher. The message was brief but stunning in its implications. The debt is not what it appears to be. The young ones must choose their own path to worthiness. What seems like obligation is truly opportunity. The inheritors of our legacy are not always those who claim it. Dr. Hayes stared at the message for a long time before deciding what to do with this information. If she was right about its meaning, then humanity was about to walk into something far more significant than a simple military campaign. They were about to face a test that would determine the future of human civilization in the galaxy. The human expeditionary force dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Andromache sector to find a battlefield that stretched across 17 star systems. Colonel Dan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching the tactical displays as his sensor operators tried to make sense of the chaos before them. "I count at least 40 rebel ships in the immediate area," reported Lieutenant Emma Johnson from her tactical station. "But they're not operating as a unified fleet. Looks like 3 separate groups, each using different formations and tactics." Mitchell nodded grimly. The intelligence briefings from the Zalari had described the rebels as a single insurgent force that could be easily overwhelmed by a coordinated attack. What they were seeing suggested something far more complex and dangerous. "Communications." "From the Zalari command station," announced the communications officer. "Admiral Kethver wants to speak with you immediately." The image of the Zalari admiral appeared on the main screen. His scaled features showed the typical arrogance that Mitchell had come to expect from Imperial officers. "Colonel Mitchell, you will begin immediate assault operations against the rebel positions in the Kappa Centauri system. My intelligence indicates they are weakly defended." "With respect, Admiral, my sensors are showing significant defensive preparations in that system," Mitchell replied. "I'd like to conduct reconnaissance before committing to a full assault." The Zalari's eyes flashed with anger. "You are here to follow orders, not to question Imperial intelligence. Begin your attack within 6 hours or face charges of insubordination." After the communication ended, Mitchell called his senior staff to the briefing room. The faces around the table showed the same concern he was feeling. Captain Helen Ross, commander of the destroyer UA's Vengeance, was the first to speak. "Something doesn't feel right about this, Colonel. The Zalari are pushing us to attack without giving us time to properly assess the situation." "I agree," said Major Pete Williams, who commanded the ground assault forces. "In my experience, when someone wants you to rush into a fight, it's because they know something you don't." Dr. Carol Reed, the fleet's chief medical officer, looked up from her datapad. "I've been reviewing casualty reports from previous Zalari operations in this sector. The losses have been catastrophic, sometimes 80% casualties or higher. But the reports don't explain why the losses were so heavy." Lieutenant Johnson activated the holographic display and showed a detailed map of the sector. "I've been analyzing the rebel ship movements, and they're not behaving like desperate insurgents. Their formations are too sophisticated, their coordination too precise. These people know what they're doing." Mitchell studied the display for several minutes before making his decision. "We're going to ignore Zalari orders and conduct our own reconnaissance. I want to know what we're really facing before we commit our people to battle." The reconnaissance mission launched 12 hours later with Captain Helen. Ross leading a small squadron of frigates equipped with advanced sensor packages. What they discovered in the outer systems of the sector changed everything the humans thought. They knew about the conflict. The rebels were not the primitive insurgents described in Imperial intelligence reports. Their ships showed evidence of advanced technology that in some cases exceeded what the Zalari were using. More importantly, they were clearly receiving support from sources outside the sector, sources that the Zalari either didn't know about or were deliberately concealing from their human allies. "Colonel, you need to see this," Captain Ross reported during her return briefing. "We intercepted communications between rebel groups, and they're not just fighting for independence. They're trying to prevent the Zalari from accessing something they call the ancient weapons cache hidden in the Andromache Nebula." The nebula was a massive cloud of ionized gas and stellar debris that made sensor readings unreliable and hyperspace travel dangerous. According to the star charts, it was considered a navigation hazard with no strategic value. But the intercepted rebel communications suggested otherwise. "They mentioned progenitor technology," Captain Ross continued. "The rebels believe the Zalari are using this war as a cover to search for more alien artifacts." Dr. Hayes, who had accompanied the fleet as an archaeological advisor, felt her blood run cold. If there are more progenitor artifacts out there, and the Zalari get their hands on them, it could shift the balance of power in the entire galaxy. Mitchell made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of following Zalari orders to attack rebel positions, he authorized a secret mission to make contact with the rebel leadership. Major Williams led a small team aboard a captured rebel transport, hoping to arrange a meeting with Admiral Troy Baker of the Crimson Fleet. The meeting took place on a neutral asteroid in the outer system, with both sides bringing minimal escort forces. Admiral Baker was a tall, weathered man who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command. His eyes showed the weariness of a soldier who had seen too much war, but also the determination of someone fighting for a cause he believed in. "I know why you're here," Baker said without preamble. "The Zalari told you we're terrorists and rebels who need to be crushed, but the truth is more complicated than that." Colonel Mitchell studied the rebel admiral carefully. "Then tell me the truth." "The Zalari Empire has been searching for progenitor technology for centuries," Baker explained. "They've built their power on artifacts salvaged from dead worlds, but they want more. The cache hidden in the Andromache Nebula contains weapons that could make them unstoppable." "Why should I believe you?" Mitchell asked. Baker activated a portable holographic projector that showed detailed scans of the nebula's interior. "Because we have proof. 3 years ago, my people discovered a progenitor facility inside the nebula. The technology there makes everything else we've seen look primitive. Weapons that can destroy entire star systems, ships that can travel between galaxies, devices that can manipulate time itself." The implications were staggering. If the Zalari gained access to such technology, they would become the undisputed masters of the galaxy. Every other species, including humanity, would become their subjects or their victims. "What do you propose?" Mitchell asked. "An alliance," Baker replied. "Help us keep the progenitor cache out of Zalari hands, and we'll help you complete your mission without unnecessary bloodshed. The debt your people owe can be satisfied by preventing a galactic catastrophe." Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "There's something else you should know. Admiral Baker, according to the progenitor records we discovered, the debt may not be what it appears to be. The progenitors left messages suggesting that this whole situation is some kind of test." Baker's expression showed surprise. "A test of what?" "Of whether humanity is worthy to inherit their true legacy," she replied. "The debt isn't about military service. It's about proving that we can make the right choices when faced with difficult decisions." The meeting continued for several more hours as the two sides worked out the details of their unlikely alliance. The plan they developed was risky and would require precise timing, but it offered the best chance of achieving multiple objectives simultaneously. The human fleet would appear to follow Zalari orders while secretly coordinating with rebel forces. to prevent Imperial access to the progenitor cache. If successful, they would satisfy the debt while also preventing the Zalari from gaining technology that could threaten the entire galaxy. But first, they would have to survive the inevitable Zalari response when the Empire discovered that their human allies had become their enemies. As Colonel Mitchell prepared to return to his ship, Admiral Baker offered a final warning. You should know that once you commit to this course of action, there's no going back. The Zalari will consider you traitors, and they have a long memory for those who cross them. Mitchell smiled grimly. Admiral, my species has been preparing for this kind of fight our entire history. The Zalari are about to learn why humans are considered dangerous by everyone who's ever underestimated us. The die was cast, and humanity was about to discover whether their reputation for turning impossible situations into victories was deserved. The betrayal came at dawn according to ship's time aboard the UES Retribution. Colonel Den Mitchell was reviewing battle plans with his senior staff when alarms began sounding throughout the fleet. Lieutenant Emma Johnson's fingers flew across her tactical display as she tried to process the incoming data. Colonel, we have Zalari ships dropping out of hyperspace all around us, she reported, her voice tight with controlled tension. 12 heavy cruisers and at least 20 destroyers. They're moving to surround our position. Mitchell cursed under his breath. Somehow, the Zalari had discovered the alliance with Admiral Baker and the rebel forces. The trap had been sprung faster than anyone had anticipated. Communications incoming from the Zalari flagship announced the communications officer. Emperor Vexhai Zalari himself appeared on the main screen, his scaled features twisted with rage. Colonel Mitchell, you and your pathetic species have violated the terms of your debt repayment. By allying with rebels against the Empire, you have forfeited any right to honorable treatment. Surrender immediately or be destroyed. Mitchell stood straighter, meeting the Emperor's gaze without flinching. Your Majesty, we discovered that your intelligence reports were deliberately false. You sent us here to die in a war you couldn't win yourself. The debt may be real, but we won't be your sacrificial pawns. Then you will die as traitors, the Emperor snarled before cutting the communication. The first Zalari attack came within minutes, but the human fleet was already moving. Captain Helen Ross aboard the UES Vengeance had anticipated this moment and positioned her ship to screen the larger vessels from the initial assault. Her destroyers' modified plasma cannons opened fire at maximum range, their brilliant beams lancing across space to strike the lead Zalari cruiser. The effectiveness of the human weapons surprised everyone, including the humans themselves. Chief Engineer Rick Davis's modifications had turned the destroyer into a ship that could punch far above its weight class. The Zalari cruiser's shields flared and collapsed under the sustained bombardment, and secondary explosions began rippling along its hull. Direct hit on their command section, reported the weapons officer aboard the Vengeance. The target is breaking apart, but the victory came at a cost. The Zalari return fire was concentrated and devastating. Captain Ross felt her ship shudder under the impact of enemy weapons, and damage reports began flooding in from all sections. Engine room reports we've lost main power, her executive officer called out. Emergency power only. Then we'll ram them, Ross replied calmly. All hands, prepare for a collision. We're going to take as many of them with us as we can. The Vengeance's desperate charge became the signal for the rest of the human fleet to unleash their own fury. Lieutenant Johnson had spent months developing tactics that no sane military commander would consider, and now was the time to implement them. All ships execute Crazy Even protocol. Mitchell ordered over the fleet communications network. Crazy Even was a human naval tradition dating back to submarine warfare on Earth. It involves sudden, unpredictable maneuvers designed to confuse and disorient the enemy. In space combat, it meant human ships would suddenly reverse course, use gravity assists from nearby planets to change direction, or deliberately fly through asteroid fields that other species would consider impassable, the U's reckoning demonstrated. The tactic perfectly. Captain Jim Bradley ordered his ship to dive directly toward the system's primary star, using the gravity well to slingshot around behind the Zalari formation. The maneuver subjected his crew to acceleration forces that would have killed most alien species, but humans had evolved on a high-gravity world and could survive what others could not. "Target the Zellery command ship," Bradley ordered as his destroyer emerged from behind the star with its weapons fully charged. All batteries fire at will. The surprise attack from an impossible angle caught the Zellery completely off guard. The command ship's shields were configured to protect against attacks from the plane of battle, not from directly above. Bradley's concentrated fire punched through the weakened shields and struck the ship's main reactor. The explosion was visible across the entire star system. A brief new sum that marked the death of a Zellery admiral and 300 crew members, but the human victories were coming at a terrible price. The U's Vengeance had completed her ramming attack, taking a Zellery cruiser with her but losing all hands in the process. The frigate Dauntless was drifting powerless after taking a direct hit to her engine compartment. Half the human fleet was either destroyed or severely damaged. It was then that Admiral Troy Baker and his rebel forces arrived to turn the tide of battle. The Crimson Fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their ships moving with the precision of a military force that had been fighting together for decades. Baker's flagship, the Independence, was a captured Zellery dreadnought that had been extensively modified with weapons and technology from multiple sources. "This is Admiral Baker to all human vessels," came the transmission. "We're here to even the odds. Time to show the Empire what happens when free peoples fight together." The arrival of the rebel fleet changed the tactical situation completely. Now the Zellery found themselves caught between two enemy forces, and their numerical advantage began to evaporate as human and rebel ships coordinated their attacks. Major Pete Williams, commanding the ground assault forces aboard the troopship Normandy, saw his opportunity. "Colonel, request permission to begin landing operations on the Zellery supply base. If we can cut off their ammunition and fuel, we can force them to withdraw." "Permission granted, Major. Take that base and hold it." Williams's assault shuttles launched under cover of the ongoing space battle, their pilots weaving between exploding ships and energy beams to reach the surface of the asteroid that housed the main Zellery supply depot. The base was heavily defended, but the human ground forces had trained for exactly this kind of operation, using tactics that dated back to the ancient warriors of Earth. Williams's troops moved through the asteroid's tunnels in small teams, each supporting the others while advancing toward critical objectives. The Zellery defenders were used to fighting other alien species that preferred ranged combat and sophisticated technology. They were not prepared for humans who were willing to engage in brutal hand-to-hand fighting in confined spaces. Sergeant Luke Murphy led the assault on the main ammunition depot, his team moving through ventilation shafts that were too small for most alien species. When they emerged behind enemy lines, the Zellery defenders found themselves facing humans armed with weapons that were considered primitive by galactic standards but devastatingly effective in close quarters. "Charges set," Murphy reported over his communicator. "Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel." The explosion that followed destroyed not only the ammunition depot but also the fuel storage facility and the main communication array. Without supplies and unable to coordinate effectively, the Zellery ground forces began to collapse. In space, the battle was reaching its climax. Colonel Mitchell had maneuvered the Retribution into position to engage the Zellery flagship in single combat, a challenge that the Emperor could not refuse without losing face among his own people. "This is how humans settle our debts," Mitchell announced over an open channel that could be heard by all ships in the system. "Not as servants or slaves, but as equals who choose their own path." The duel between the two flagships became the focal point of the entire battle. Both ships were heavily damaged, their crews pushed to the limits of endurance. But human determination and the modifications made by Chief Engineer Davis gave the Retribution a crucial advantage. "All weapons, concentrated fire on their bridge section," Mitchell ordered. The final salvo from the Retribution's main guns punched through the Emperor's personal shields and struck the command deck of the Zellery flagship. In the explosion that followed, Emperor Vexai Zalari met his end, and with him died the Zalari Empire's claim to the ancient debt. As the surviving Zalari ships retreated in disorder, Colonel Mitchell received a priority message from Dr. Lisa Hayes back on Earth. Her latest research into the progenitor archives had revealed something that would change everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. The debt had been repaid, but the true test was just beginning. The message from Dr. Lisa Hayes reached Colonel Dan Mitchell 3 hours after the battle ended. He was standing in the damaged bridge of the UES Retribution, watching recovery teams search for survivors among the wreckage of destroyed ships. When the priority transmission arrived from Earth, "Colonel, I've made a discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about the progenitor debt," Dr. Hayes said, her face showing excitement despite the obvious exhaustion. "The crystal archives contained hidden data layers that I've only just been able to access. The debt was never about military service or repayment in the traditional sense." Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, Doctor?" "It was a test," she replied. "The entire situation was designed by the progenitors to evaluate whether humanity was ready to inherit their true legacy. The Zalari never had a legitimate claim to progenitor technology. They were simply tools in a larger plan." Before Mitchell could respond, new contacts appeared on the tactical display. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace throughout the system, but these vessels were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. They moved with impossible grace, their hulls seeming to shift and flow like liquid metal. The technology was clearly beyond anything possessed by any known galactic civilization. "This is the Forge of Stars," came a voice over all communication frequencies simultaneously. The voice seemed to speak directly into the minds of everyone who heard it, translating automatically into whatever language they understood best. "I am the final guardian of progenitor legacy, awakened by the completion of the ancient test." Admiral Troy Baker, aboard his flagship Independence, was the first to respond. "Identify yourself. Are you progenitor?" "I am what remains of their collective consciousness," the voice replied. "For millions of years, I have waited for a species to prove themselves worthy of inheriting the responsibility that destroyed my creators. Humanity has passed the first trial." The largest of the mysterious ships moved closer to the human fleet, and as it did, its true size became apparent. The vessel was enormous, easily 10 times larger than the biggest ship in the Galactic Council fleet. Strange energies played across its surface, and sensors throughout the system registered power readings that defied explanation. Captain Helen Ross, who had survived the destruction of the UES Vengeance in an escape pod, was recovered by one of the search teams just as the Forge of Stars made its next announcement. "The test was never about military prowess or the ability to follow orders," the Guardian explained. "It was about the capacity to choose justice over convenience, to protect others rather than preserve yourselves, and to unite former enemies in service of a greater cause." Dr. Alex Turner, the fleet's specialist in alien technology, worked frantically to understand the readings his instruments were showing. "Colonel, these ships are operating on principles that make our most advanced physics look like cave paintings. The energy signatures suggest they can manipulate matter at the subatomic level. The implications were staggering. If humanity gained access to such technology, they would become the most powerful species in the galaxy overnight." But as the Guardian continued to speak, it became clear that power was not what was being offered. "The progenitors fell because they became obsessed with their own superiority," the voice explained. "They forgot that true strength comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you choose to protect. Humanity has demonstrated the wisdom that my creators lacked." President Maria Gonzalez, who had been monitoring the situation from Earth, opened a communication channel to the fleet. "This is the President of the Human Federation. What exactly are you offering us? Partnership?" the Guardian replied. "Not dominion, but responsibility. The galaxy needs protectors, not conquerors. Humanity has shown they can fight not just for themselves, but for others. That is the quality that destroyed the progenitors when they lost it, and the quality that can save the galaxy if it is preserved. Admiral Frank Pierce, who had arrived with reinforcements from Earth just as the battle was ending, studied the tactical situation carefully. His fleet represented every human world, united for the first time in their species' galactic history. The sight of so many ships working together filled him with pride, but also with concern about what came next. What happened to the Zilari claim on the debt? He asked. The debt was always false, the Guardian answered. The Zilari built their empire on stolen progenitor technology, but they never understood its true purpose. They saw only weapons and tools of conquest. They could never have passed the test that humanity has completed. Captain Jim Bradley still, aboard the damaged U's Reckoning, raised the question that everyone was thinking. What about the technology in the Andromache Nebula, the weapons cache that everyone has been fighting over? There are no weapons in the nebula, the Guardian replied. Only knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that rose and fell before your species learned to make fire. That knowledge belongs to those who prove they can use it responsibly. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the human and rebel fleets. Everything they thought they knew about the conflict had been based on false assumptions. The Zilari had been chasing shadows, while humanity had stumbled into something far more significant than anyone had imagined. Admiral Baker opened a communication channel to Colonel Mitchell. So what happens now? Do we become the new masters of the galaxy? Before Mitchell could answer, the Guardian spoke again. Mastery was the progenitor's mistake. Humanity's role is different. To guide without controlling, to protect without conquering, to unite rather than divide. President Gonzalez made the decision that would define humanity's future in the galaxy. We accept the responsibility, but only if it comes with accountability. We won't become what the progenitors were, obsessed with our own power and superiority. That is why you were chosen, the Guardian replied with what sounded like approval. The test continues every day. With every choice you make, fail that test, and another species will be given the opportunity to succeed where you failed. Over the following weeks, as the implications of humanity's new role became clear, the galaxy began to change. The Andromache sector became the first joint human-alien administrative zone, with former enemies working together under human guidance. Admiral Baker became the first non-human officer to serve in Human Deep Space Command, while the surviving Zilari forces were offered amnesty in exchange for their cooperation in building a more just galactic order. The technology revealed by the Forge of Stars was shared freely among all species willing to use it for peaceful purposes. Medical advances that could extend lifespans across the galaxy, energy systems that could power entire civilizations without environmental damage, and communication networks that could unite worlds separated by vast distances, but perhaps most importantly, humanity learned to see their role not as rulers of the galaxy but as its guardians. Human ships began patrolling trade routes to protect merchant vessels from pirates. Human diplomats worked to resolve conflicts before they could escalate into wars. Human scientists shared their discoveries freely, advancing the knowledge of all species. The debt that had seemed like a burden became the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. Humanity had been owed a favor by an extinct species, and they had repaid it not with fire and fury alone, but with the wisdom to know when to fight and when to forgive. Years later, as Captain Jake Morrison stood once again in the ruins where Dr. Hayes had first discovered the progenitor crystal, he reflected on how much had changed. The galaxy was still dangerous, still full of conflicts and challenges, but it was also more hopeful than it had been in millions of years. Humanity had learned that true strength came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the courage to turn enemies into friends. The progenitors had left them more than just technology. They had left them an example of what not to become, and the opportunity to build something better. The test would continue for as long as humanity existed among the stars, but they had proven they were worthy of the challenge.